Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Boss Economic World, where trade wars meet trench warfare in the global economy. Today, we dive into the latest episode of the never-ending saga between the United States and the European Union, a saga that makes even the most dramatic telenovela look like child's play. Grab your popcorn, or your spreadsheets, and let's break down how Trump's steel and aluminum tariffs are once again rattling the global trade cages and what it means for your wallet and the world economy. Imagine a chess game where every move triggers a global financial earthquake. That's exactly what we have today. The U.S. administration, under the lingering ghost of Donald Trump's America First doctrine, has announced tariffs on European steel and aluminum exports estimated by the EU to impact as much as €28 billion, roughly $29.3 billion, of EU exports. That's not your typical slap on the wrist, this is a full-blown economic knockout punch. But wait, the EU isn't just going to stand there like a deer in headlights. This is a classic case of, you cut my exports, I'll slice yours, a trade war rematch where every tariff is a counter-tariff, and every counter is a vicious reminder of past economic miscalculations. Back in Trump's first term in 2018, the U.S. hit nearly $7 billion worth of European steel and aluminum exports, citing national security concerns. Today, the stakes are 4 times higher. Talk about an economic amnesia fever, has anyone learned our lesson yet? From an economist's view, tariffs have long been a tool, if wielded judiciously, to protect domestic industries. However, when used as a political weapon, they often resemble economic boomerangs rather than shields. The new 25% tariff on steel and aluminum, with no planned exemptions this time, is a textbook example of protectionism taken too far. Classical economics tells us that imposing tariffs on imported goods raises their domestic price, reduces consumer surplus, and distorts market efficiency. While domestic steel and aluminum producers might momentarily rejoice with higher prices, downstream industries, think automotive and construction, will bear the brunt, facing increased production costs and reduced international competitiveness. Consider the example of the U.S. automotive industry, which has long been a target of import restrictions. According to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the U.S. auto sector contributes over 3% to the national GDP and employs millions. Increasing production costs due to tariffs can lead to higher prices for consumers, reduced export competitiveness, and even offshoring production, a chain reaction of disruption. Economic principles of comparative advantage suggest that countries should specialize in producing goods where they have relative efficiency and trade for others. The U.S., with its technological prowess, was never the natural home for steel and aluminum manufacturing supremacy. Those are sectors where economies of scale, abundant raw materials, and established supply chains reign supreme in Europe and other parts of the world. By applying tariffs, the U.S. is essentially saying, we prefer inefficiency. By imposing a tax on international trade, we force our domestic industries to suffer from misallocated resources. The result? A misallocation of production factors that ultimately hurts the overall economy, a phenomenon meticulously explained by modern trade theory and reiterated by the late economist Paul Krugman. History is replete with examples of tit-for-tat trade battles. In the late 2000s, when the U.S. and China engaged in a spat over various goods, global supply chains trembled. The 2018 tariffs were reminiscent of yesteryears when protectionism led to diminished global welfare. The current escalation, however, is in a new era, an era defined by deep global interconnectedness. The repercussions of these tariffs won't be isolated to steel mills in Ohio or smelters in Hamburg, every linked market feels the shockwaves. For instance, consider the Trump administration's earlier attempt to structure reciprocal tariffs based on policies it perceived as obstacles to U.S. trade. This tit-for-tat approach, although seemingly balanced on paper, often transforms into a vicious cycle of escalating protectionism. Researchers at the Peterson Institute for International Economics have warned that such cycles can lead to what is known as a tariff spiral, a scenario in which each new tariff necessitates another, dragging global economic growth downward. Recent data from the International Monetary Fund, IMF, indicate that if the current escalation continues unchecked, global GDP growth could decline by an additional 0.5% over the next 2 years, a not-so-insignificant amount when billions depend on growth for employment and public services. In response, the European Commission hasn't twiddled its economic thumbs. EU Trade Chief Maros Šefčovič's recent meetings in Washington with his U.S. counterparts, even as trade details remain in flux, signal that the EU is preparing its countermeasures, which include reactivating the suspended tariffs from previous rounds. Those measures, while politically charged, are tactically designed to hit politically sensitive companies and industries on the U.S. side, including the likes of Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Levi Strauss jeans. This strategic targeting is not just about monetary retaliation, it's about sending a message: don't mess with Europe's exports or you'll pay in more than just dollars. It's also a matter of political optics. As the economic chessboard in Washington and Brussels encounters these provocative moves, voters on both sides of the Atlantic are watching closely. While U.S. politicians tout protectionist measures as a boon for domestic job creation, the reality is that retaliatory tariffs extend the negative ripple effects to consumers worldwide. It's a bit like trying to treat a headache by hitting yourself in the head with a hammer, painful for everyone involved. The Commission's preparation of various lists targeting different sectors shows a nuanced approach aimed not just at inflicting immediate financial pain to American companies, but at targeting industries that might sway public opinion or electoral outcomes. The calculated selection of targets underscores the EU's acknowledgement that trade policy is as much about politics as it is about economics. Let's not ignore the government mismanagement that has contributed to this volatile scenario. While the U.S. government under Trump, and even now, its successors, struggles to balance its domestic industrial policies with the demands of a globalized economy, the EU finds itself in a bind of its own making. The decision to impose reciprocal tariffs has, in part, been a knee-jerk reaction to what it perceives as American economic encroachment. However, critics argue that this response is emblematic of deeper strategic misalignments. Consider the data from Eurostat, which revealed that the EU's manufacturing sector contracted by 4.5% last year, a figure that many economists attribute to overall weak industrial policies and a failure to modernize supply chains. In such a scenario, while tariffs might offer a temporary political victory, they are not a substitute for long-term economic reforms. Instead, they risk further isolation from the global value chain, essentially locking Europe into a cycle of inefficiency and higher production costs. Furthermore, governments on both sides of the Atlantic seem to have forgotten that the global market favors innovation, efficiency, and open competition, principles that tariffs are designed to undermine. The United States, by resorting to protectionism, not only harms its consumers through higher prices but also discourages international tech and innovation collaboration. Meanwhile, the EU's reactive measures, though designed to protect its own industries, risk alienating key trade partners in an increasingly multipolar world where China and emerging economies dictate new trade rules. What does this mean for the global economic order? When the titans of the economy, be it the US or the EU, engage in such high-stakes tariff battles, emerging economies are caught in the crossfire. The ripple effects are palpable, from disrupted supply chains to inflated commodity prices, and even a slowdown in global investment flows. For instance, the World Bank recently warned that escalating trade disputes could lead to a decline in global foreign direct investment, FDI, by nearly 10% over the next 5 years. In an era where FDI is one of the key drivers of sustainable development and technological transfer, such a decline could stifle growth, particularly in developing countries that rely heavily on foreign capital. Let's talk numbers. In Q3 2023, global trade volumes grew at a modest pace of 2.8%, far below the historical average of 4.5% pre-pandemic. This slowdown isn't just a temporary hiccup, it's a symptom of deeper systemic issues exacerbated by policy decisions that favor short-term political victories over long-term economic stability. Real-world examples abound. Consider the case of the automotive supply chain in Eastern Europe, which has been significantly disrupted by the uncertainty of tariff policies. Manufacturers have reported production delays and increased logistics costs, factors that not only hurt profit margins but also lead to higher end-user prices. Such inefficiencies highlight the delicate balance between globalization and economic nationalism, a balance that seems to be tilting dangerously toward the latter. Beyond the hard numbers and economic theories, there's a critical narrative at play, a narrative of power and perception. Politicians, whether in Washington or Brussels, are quick to claim that protecting domestic industries is paramount. But as many seasoned economists would note, if every country adopts a protectionist stance, the global economy becomes a desolate landscape of inefficiency and stagnation. Take the recent remarks of Maros Sefcovic during his debriefing of EU ambassadors. While his tone was measured and his proposals seemed conciliatory, offering a deal to lower tariffs on industrial goods, including cars, the underlying message was clear. The EU is not merely a passive player, it's a challenger, ready to reassert its influence on the global trade stage. Yet, this bold rhetoric is matched by a need for pragmatism. The EU's readiness to unfreeze previously suspended tariffs swiftly underscores a readiness to escalate if its demands, and indeed, its interests, are not met. In Washington, the U.S. administration's promotion of reciprocal tariffs is part of a broader strategy aimed at recasting global trade rules. However, this strategy is fraught with contradictions. On one hand, it seeks to protect American jobs and industries. On the other, it undermines the very benefits of a free and open global market that, for decades, have lifted millions out of poverty and spurred unprecedented technological advances. A recent study by the Brookings Institution indicated that if trade disputes continue to escalate, U.S. real wages could stagnate for another decade, partly because of the rising costs associated with imported inputs. It's a classic case of the protectionist paradox. By trying to shield domestic markets, policymakers might inadvertently set the stage for a prolonged economic downturn. As we stand at this precarious juncture, the moral of the story becomes painfully clear. in the high-stakes world of global trade, ideological rigidity and short-term political maneuvering are the enemy of sustainable economic progress. The current tariff saga between the US and the EU is a stark reminder that economic policy should be about fostering long-term stability and growth, not about scorekeeping in a political vendetta. The numbers tell the story: Euro 28 billion in affected exports, a potential global GDP decline of 0.5%, and a slowdown in trade volumes that underscores deep systemic vulnerabilities. And yet, behind these dry figures lies a human story, a story of factories shuttered, jobs lost, supply chains disrupted, and ultimately, lives thrown into disarray by decisions that seem more about optics than economic logic. What, then, is the way forward? It isn't a return to the old guard of protectionism. It's not about demonizing open trade, it's about reforming it. Policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic need to adopt a pragmatic approach that marries the ironclad logic of economic theory with the messy realities of international politics. They must recognize that while tariffs can serve as a temporary band-aid, they are no substitute for comprehensive policies that address the root causes of industrial decline and global economic dislocation. For the everyday citizen and the seasoned financial professional alike, the takeaway is crystal clear: global economic interdependence is a double-edged sword. Yes, it offers the promise of growth and innovation, but it also demands a level of coordination and rationality that, unfortunately, seems to elude many of our political leaders. If history has taught us anything, it is that when ideology trumps pragmatism, everyone pays the bill, often with interest. In the meantime, as we watch this latest trade war unfold like a high-budget thriller with exceptionally high stakes, one must remember that true economic leadership lies not in making grandiose threats or indulging in tit-for-tat retaliations, but in crafting policies that promote sustainable development, global cooperation, and an economy that works for everyone. This is your host at Boss Economic World signing off. Until next time, keep your economic wits about you, question every policy, and remember, in the arena of global trade, the only winners are those who see beyond the rhetoric and into the numbers. Stay savvy, folks.